proving if nothing that I've got my finger on the pulse of popular culture, I decided it would be a good idea to do a review of a 4-year-old game that by all accounts was a bit of a flop when it first came out in the first place, and which, according to Wikipedia, received mixed to average reviews on its first release. The reason for me wanting to talk about it now though is twofold. The biggest reason is because of the fact I started playing it for the very first time this week, and I've been playing it pretty solidly for the entire week. The second is because I specifically mentioned the game when I did my review of Sonic and All-Star Transformed a couple of years back. You see, at that point in time, I hadn't actually played the game, but I had formed a fairly negative opinion of it in my head, just based on a few things that I'd seen and heard about it. Let's go back to my original Sonic Transformed retro review to see what I said about it back then, and to see if my opinion of it has changed now that I've actually had a chance to play the game. Cue going back in time corny sound effects now. Well, let's wrap things up there and draw things to a... Eh? What's that? Am I going to talk about Team Sonic Racing, the current generation follow-on game? Well, no, not really. Oh, sort of a little bit, okay. The thing is, Team Sonic Racing doesn't have any Sega characters in it that aren't related to Sonic the Hedgehog. You see, sadly, the team at Sumo Digital that were responsible for the new game's development decided, in their infinite wisdom, to drop the Sega All-Star part in this game to focus on the adventure mode instead. Studio Design Director for Team Sonic, Derek Littlewood, explained.
The reason we dropped non-Sonic Universe characters was so we could dive into the Sonic Universe in more depth and tell a canon Sonic Universe story with our Team Adventure mode. That was very important for us.
Team Sonic racing designer Ben Wilson explained how this made character exchanges a lot easier.
Because this game's set in a universe with characters who have a relationship already, it let us do a dialogue system where they're on a track and they're yelling at each other, and they have familiarity with each other and make references to history, which we wouldn't have been able to do really, had other franchise characters been present, or at least not in as smooth a way. So it let us do some additional stuff as well.
Oh, Derek, Ben, these sound like terrible reasons for not allowing me to play as the Hornet from Daytona, USA again, or racing on tracks inspired by Shinobi and Golden Axe. Are you seriously telling me there's no possible way you could have made a cross-franchise adventure mode work? I mean, isn't this the exact same thing that the Kingdom Hearts games have been doing for God knows however many years now? Why does a racing game even need an adventure mode, for chuff's sake? Maybe I'm cutting off my nose to spite my face here by not even giving the game a chance, and some of you may well be getting a sense of deja vu here, as I'd similarly dismissed the first game out of hand originally. And in truth, I love the Sonic themed stages in Transform just as much as the Sega Heritage ones. In fact, the Galactic Parade one is one of the best looking stages in the entire game in my opinion. The effect when the spaceship in the distance here zooms in, and the track goes into it and you realise just how gargantuan it is, never ceases to impress me. But by completely dropping all the Sega All-Star characters and concentrating entirely on Sonic and his band of chums, you have effectively made me lose all interest in Team Sonic. Whilst you could argue that the inclusion of all the tracks and characters that pay tribute to the Sega games of old and Transformed are a purely superficial detail and the gameplay is what's all important, I'd go so far as to argue that it's the inclusion of these things that very much help make the gameplay what it is, as each level isn't just some generic Sonic theme, it's an interactive trip into Sega's past. The level variety is what has added so much to Transformed's replayability for me, and why I'm still coming back to it now, 8 years after it was first released. By stripping out the Sega All-Star part, all you're left with then is a generic karting game. Anyway, I don't want to end the video on a sour note by putting the boot into Team Sonic Racing. It just feels to me like dropping the Sega All-Stars part was, as Metro said, a backward step for no obvious gain. It feels like a missed opportunity as well when you consider that there are still so many things that they could do with the old Sega IPs out there. Imagine a Transform sequel that had a Daytona USA theme level, made up of parts of 37 Speedway, Dinosaur Canyon and Seaside Street Galaxy. What about a playable Super Hang-On bike? Or the ship from Galaxy Force? Or the chopper from Thunderblade? What about a Virtua Racing theme level made up of untextured polygons? A Fantasy Zone one with the return of Opa Opa? What about some Streets of Rage love? Or a Sega Rally or Scud Race tribute? There are literally so many possibilities. Maybe I'm the one living in a fantasy zone, by thinking that Sega even cares about whether someone who's over 40 even figures into their target demographic for a Sonic karting game. So do I still stand by those comments that Team Sonic is a backward step from Transformed? Yes, I definitely do. Did losing all the Sega characters and stages affect my decision to buy this game? Yes, it most certainly did. In fact, I didn't ever actually buy it. This version that I'm playing here was given away free as a PlayStation Plus game back in February of 2022. And I think it speaks volumes about what I thought about this game, that it's actually taken me over a year and a half to start playing it. Does this mean though that I think it's a bad game? No, not at all. I have generally been very much enjoying playing it, apart from a couple of the challenge modes which I thought were unnecessary exercises and frustration. But luckily these aren't really connected in any way to any significant parts of the game that you unlock as you play through it. At the very core of the game, you've got a very solid and competent handling kart racer that feels very intuitive and easy to pick up and play for anyone that's familiar with Transformed or Sonic and All-Star Racing. The team gameplay gimmick, which was heavily publicised when the game was first released, and something which I was rather sceptical about, actually works pretty well here, with your team of 3 different characters swapping items back and forth between each other to help you win the race as a team overall. With the greater the level of cooperation between you and your teammates building up your ultimate gauge, which gives you a brief burst of speed and invincibility. One of the things I really liked about this team gameplay mechanic was some of the gameplay innovations that it allowed, such as being able to drive in the tyre tracks of one of your teammates, giving you a burst of additional speed and also helping to build up your team ultimate gauge, and also the way you could get speed boosts by driving past your teammates as well. Just like in Transformed, you can also get a speed boost by doing mid-air flips and spins after you come off jumps. Just like Transformed, the game has got a pretty banging soundtrack, with a good mixture of rocky and dancey tunes, with long-term Sega musical maestro Richard Jacks returning on composition duties, along with another Sega and Sonic audio veteran, Jun Sinu. I'm always a really big fan of these high-energy drum and bass style tracks that you get in these types of games, and I was very happy to see some new arranged versions of Richard Jacks' classic Sonic R tunes, Can You Feel the Sunshine and Supersonic Racing, included in new arranged forms here. I promise I won't sing again in this. So the game plays well and it sounds great, but what about the visuals? Well, as you've been able to see for yourself, the game looks absolutely fantastic, I reckon. The tracks are bright and colourful and there's always lots going on during the race. Best of all though, Team Sonic Racing runs at 60 frames per second. This is in stark contrast to Transformed, which ran at only 30 frames per second on the previous generation of consoles, with only the PC game managing to achieve that magical 60 frames per second refresh rate. There's actually a couple of reoccurring tracks from the old games which pop up in Team Sonic, and highlighting them side by side it really helps to highlight the graphical fidelity of the PS4 version compared to those older games. Now the only problem with these tracks looking so good like this is it just frustrates me even more as to what could have been if this had been a proper continuation in the Sonic and All-Star Transformed series, rather than a standalone Sonic racing game. Now, before I continue this train of thought, all the Team Sonic footage you've seen in the video so far is something that I recorded externally using a capture device, which was intended for these split-screen comparisons you can see on the TV screen at the moment. I'm going to be moving over from this now to footage that I recorded directly using the PlayStation 4's internal capture. Unfortunately, this footage isn't as nice looking, it only captures at 30 frames a second and in a lower resolution, just to warn you. So where were we? Oh yes, that's right. At the risk of sounding like a stuck record, I was about to bemoan the lack of the other Sega franchises in this game. Now, if you're thinking to yourself at this point, oh FFS Alex, just get over it. Hear me out, I have a good reason behind this. Now, as beautifully smooth and colourful as all the stages in Team Sonic are, they are a little bit on the generic side, featuring well-worn gaming tropes like sand, fire and ice levels. There's even a haunted house, although at least that does give you slight House of the Dead type vibes. Now, to make matters worse here, the tracks are actually divided up into threes, into separate game worlds, and the trouble with this is that by having tracks that are thematically quite similar like this, they tend to blur into one in my brain a little bit. For example, did the game really need 3 separate casino themed tracks? Now, don't get me wrong here, I love a good casino themed track just as much as the next man, probably more so after first getting introduced to them in F-Zero GX. But did we really need 3 of them? One of the things that was so good about having the old Sega IPs in Sonic Transformed was the fact that it created a lot of variety in the environments that you were racing across, with the stages based on Outrun, Afterburner, Panzer Dragoon, Jet Set Radio, Golden Axe and Shinobi, and all those other old Sega games providing really unique and different environments. Now, as we heard earlier, the reason for the removal of the old Sega IPs in this was to concentrate on the story mode. But the story mode, such as it is absolute guff. Basically a load of non-animated cutscenes between the characters, which has absolutely zero consequence in terms of how the game actually plays. It honestly blows my mind that this load of old shite was the whole reason that the thing that I enjoyed most about the previous game was removed from this one. Now, did taking these old Sega characters out harm the game in terms of its sales? Now, in all honesty, that isn't something that I can answer. I know from my own personal experience, losing the Sega characters made me have no interest in this when it very first released. I've had no real interest in Sonic the Hedgehog or any of his chums since the 16-bit days. And just from what I've seen online, it seems there's quite a few people that agree with me on this. That losing the old Sega IPs and concentrating purely on Sonic made them not want to buy the game. However, there are also quite a few that are quite happy, it seems, to just have the focus purely on Sonic. But on a purely business level, this is what absolutely baffles me, is why Sumo Digital decided to split the fanbase like this. Because presumably the people that are big fans of Sonic would have bought the game regardless, so why take away that one element, which is going to retain a lot of the other part of your target audience as well? It just doesn't make any sense to me. As well as the inclusion of the story mode, part of the argument against having the other Sega characters in this seems to focus on the fact that maybe younger kids don't know who these characters are, and aren't going to care about the inclusion of characters like Joe Musashi from Shinobi, Gilius Thunderhead from Golden Axe, or racing on tracks from Outrun or Afterburner. But I would argue that including them is a good thing from this point of view, because maybe, just maybe, this might just pique the curiosity of some of these younger gamers and introduce them to the awesome back catalogue of games that Sega have got. The very first time I got introduced to some of these games myself, I would have only been about 10 or 11 years old, and as I mentioned earlier, just seeing how gorgeously realised the tracks in Team Sonic are it just frustrates me so much to think of what could have been. I mean, can you imagine just how awesome an updated version of this absolutely bonkers advanced stage from Daytona USA 2 would have looked in Team Sonic? I mean, with all the absolute insanity that's already going on in it, like the giant skull-headed spider, the haunted house, the laser beam shooting spaceships, the derailed subway carriage there, and then this lovely roller coaster bit that you go through here. This already looks like something that you would find in a karting game. Oh, and not forgetting the swinging pirate ship there as well. Or what about a stage based on the Beginner Day stage from Scud Race? With all its big drive-through aquarium sections and futuristic looking city, I think this would be a fantastic urban setting for a karting track, in much the same way that the Jet Set Radio one was in Sonic Transformed. I mean, hell, the Dolphin Tunnel section's even got a picture of Sonic and Tails in a car on the side of it. Team Sonic has got lots of unlockable things in it, what they call mod pods in the game, that you can basically acquire with credits from winning races, and these unlock a lot of things which cosmetically change your vehicle, such as new paint jobs, body parts and vinyl stickers that you can decorate it with. And at the very least, I don't know why Sumo couldn't have made some of these relate to some of the old Sega games. For example, giving Sonic a car that he could ride around in that looks like the Hornet from Daytona USA, in a similar fashion to how Mario Kart 8 had specific karts that referenced old Nintendo games, like being able to drive in a kart that looks like the Blue Falcon from F-Zero, and taking a leaf out of Sonic Transforms book. Mario Kart 8 even included 2 DLC tracks based on F-Zero. Now, in a case of fans taking matters into their own hands, one enterprising young fellow who goes by the name of DebugYoshi has actually managed to mod some tracks from Daytona USA into Mario Kart Double Dash. This is exactly the sort of thing I'd have liked to have seen in a sequel to Sonic and All-Star Transformed. I'll add some links to the video description so you can check out the full versions of these videos yourself. DebugYoshi really has done a great job at actually making these Daytona tracks seem really authentically Mario Kart-like, right down to the music changing and becoming a bit tinny and distorted if you get hit with the item that makes you shrink down. And also the final lap music speeding up just like in the real game. Now, something else we haven't talked about in terms of a backward step that Team Sonic makes is the removal of the transformed mechanic. Something that I thought really evolved the gameplay of the second game compared to the first one, and the removal of which can only be seen as a backward step for no gain at all in terms of how the game itself plays. And whilst I'm in hypercritical mode here, another thing which I definitely think isn't as good as Transformed are the selection of items that you receive. It's quite difficult to tell what does what when you're first playing the game. They all look like weird little squid things. Another slight annoyance for me as far as the items were concerned is that the items you get seems to be tied to your progress in the game. So if you're doing well, you tend to only get the same 3 items turning up each time, which is normally the cube, the rocket and the fire racing tracks thing that you can leave behind you. You don't tend to get some of the more interesting things dropping, like this awesome drill thing here, or the lightning wisp that can take out all the lead players unless you're doing particularly badly at the game. Other items are only usable by certain other characters depending on whether you're playing as a speed, technique or a heavy type, and I can see the reasoning behind this, but again it just annoys me a little bit because I tend to always stick with the speed type, so it means I don't really ever get to use those items that the other players can use. One area of Team Sonic which I definitely think is an improvement compared to Transformed is that progress through it is slightly easier. In both games, as well as the typical race modes, there's also a load of challenge modes which generally aren't that much fun. Like the horrible Daredevil mode you can see me playing here, where you've got to drift through these yellow and red hoops as close to the star post as you can for maximum points. If you hit the star post you lose those points. Or the ring races here, where you've got to keep drifting through rings to get time and points. In Transformed, actually having to go through some of these on the higher difficulties was mandatory if you wanted to unlock all the characters, with of course my favourite character, Ages, the one based on the Hornet from Daytona, USA, being the very final character that you unlocked, which was an absolute ball ache. Fortunately here though, for the most part, just competing in the normal races is enough to get you through to the end of the game. Some of the stages do have keys attached to them, which you need to meet certain conditions in order to obtain them. Once you've got a certain amount of keys, this normally unlocks a vinyl, which you can then use to decorate your vehicle with. In the early stages of playing through the game, I did have a go at doing some of these challenges, but I would most definitely say that this particular juice is not worth the squeeze. These vinyl stickers are generic in the extreme and are just things like stars, flames and stripy patterns. This once again strikes me as a bit of a missed opportunity for a bit of old school Sega love that Sumo could have done in a little bit more of a subtle way if they didn't want to go the route of actually adding characters and tracks in that were based on old Sega franchises. Some vinyl stickers based on the Hornet from Daytona USA that you could stick on Sonic's kart, or even something just like some stickers that look like the old Sega logo, or the old Sega AM2 logo, are the sort of things that would have kept me playing to try and unlock these keys. Instead of just making me think, well, bollocks to that, it's not worth it. One key unlocking challenge which particularly did my head in was a challenge on one of the GPs where you had to get a certain number of rings across the GP and come first in every single race of it. The annoying thing here though is that trying to keep hold of your rings is a matter of pure luck in some races, because unless you specifically keep hold of certain defensive items, there are completely unblockable attacks the CPU opponents will unleash against you, which causes you to lose all your rings in a single attack. It's really quite annoying. Oh, fuck's sake, not again! I must admit though, I am quite a big fan of this Egg Spawn Assault mode, where you have to shoot down all of Dr. Robotnik's minions, despite my general dislike of the other challenge modes, particularly if I get to play as this big crocodile guy as well. Now, although I was complaining about the CPU players there, this was really only an issue in those particular races where you needed to get through them with a certain number of rings in order to obtain the key at the end. And as we said, the keys aren't actually necessary to progress further through the game, they're purely there to unlock cosmetic things. On the whole, I actually think the CPU players in this are slightly less prone to being projectile spamming twats like they sometimes could be in Transformed. And I think maybe the team dynamic is something which helps with this, because I think just having those two CPU allies on your team means the amount of people shooting stuff at you tends to come down a little bit. One aspect that can be slightly annoying though is if you get a team that suddenly decides they're going to activate their team ultimate in the very last section of a final lap, and they suddenly go whizzing past you after you've been in first place for the entire game. That can get a bit frustrating. So there we go, those are my thoughts on Team Sonic Racing. A very polished looking and fun to play racer, which to my mind just feels like it doesn't live up to its full potential by being a true sequel to Sonic Transformed. But there we go, that's just my opinion. But enough of my wafflings, what did you think of this game? Did you enjoy it as it was without all the Sega characters? Or was that something that you really wanted to see in a sequel to Transformed? Let me know in the comments. Well, this seems as good a place as any to wrap things up. So why don't we finish off with a lap on the final level, Thunder Deck. I will catch you again sometime soon. Take care, bye bye.
Slingshot successful. Hello there, auto buddies. It's your old pal Wheeljack here. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to be an Optimus Prime and not a Negatron by making sure you hit the like button and also subscribing. We'll hopefully see you again real soon for another exciting adventure with Mr. Thunderwing.